two joints that come into play. One would be the temporomandibular joint. So we're dealing with the mandibular condyles articulating with the mandibular fossa to form the temporomandibular joint. Okay. Two line marks, one, and then vice versa. And then the next joint that we have that involves the skull would be the occipital condyles on either side of the foramen magnum. And of course, they are going to articulate with the superior articular facets of the atlas. So then we can kind of take care of one aspect of the vertebral column by thinking in terms of superior articular facets articulating with inferior articular facets. So all the way down, whether it's cervical, thoracic, or lumbar, you have that relationship of the facet joints. We've got the processes that contain the facets. So the inferior articular facet is on the inferior articular process, and the facet then articulates with the superior articular facet that's on the superior articular process. So I would be indicating the facet because that's where the joint actually takes place. And you just indicate the opposite one for the correct answer. So if the number is on the inferior, then the correct answer is the superior one. The other joint that comes into play for the vertebral column would be these symphysis joints, these cartilaginous joints that we really haven't talked a lot about, but the vertebral bodies obviously articulate with one another. So that would be a pretty straightforward answer, because if I indicated one vertebral body, then it would be the vertebral body of the vertebrae above or below, depending on whether it's the superior surface or the inferior surface of the vertebral body. Okay, so two types of joints. You've got the facet joints, and then you've got the, we haven't gotten into this terminology, it's called the symphysis joint. It indicates it's a cartilaginous joint. That is the vertebral disc or intervertebral disc that sits between the bodies. Okay, make sense? All right, so then let's see, staying with the axial skeleton, we have a joint that involves actually the axial skeleton along with what you just went over on the quiz, and that would be the articulation between the sacrum and the ilium, the sacroiliac joint. So you have those two auricular surfaces. They are articular surfaces, but they are specifically named auricular. A-U-R, not articular. So auricular surfaces. So if I indicated the auricular surface of the ilium, the correct answer would be the auricular surface of the sacrum. So that's the joint there. Let's see, back up to superior regions of the axial skeleton. So we have the connections then that take place between the sternum and the sternal ends of the clavicle. So we've got those clavicular notches. So that's another joint. So if I indicated the clavicle, the correct answer would, or the sternal end of the clavicle, the correct answer would be the clavicular notches, or sternal notches, sorry, sternal notches on the, clavicular notches, let's get this straight. Clavicular notch on the sternum, and then vice versa. Let's see, we have joints with the cartilage. I won't be doing that. All right, on the posterior part of the joint with the between the rib and the vertebrae, then that is fair game. So we have two connections there. We have the joint between the head of the rib and the facets or demifacets on the vertebral body. Then we also have the joint on the tubercle of the rib that articulates with the transverse costal facet on the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, that two-point connection, posterior.
What was the second one?
Second one would be the tubercle of the rib articulating with the transverse costal facet of the thoracic vertebrae. That's the rib connections. right, so then we move to the remainder of the upper extremity, shoulder girdle, upper extremity. So we have the AC joint, or the acromioclavicular joint. So the acromial end of the clavicle with the acromion process. So we have that connection on the shoulder girdle. And then the what's called the glenohumeral joint, which would be the joint between the glenoid cavity or fossa and the head of the humerus. So those two landmarks would connect. Let's see, at the elbow we have a couple of joints going on. The hinge joint is between the trochlea and the trochlear notch. So those two landmarks would be paired. And then we have the pivot joints that are taking place between the head of the radius and the radial notch of the ulna to allow that rotational action. That's the proximal radio-ulnar joint. The distal radio-ulnar joint then would be between the head of the ulna and the ulnar notch of the radius. Yes?
Are we gonna have to like name like the hinge joint and then say?
No, we're not really doing articulations in the sense of identifying the type of joint, hinge, pivot, etc. That'll come next. So what we're doing is just focusing on the bony landmarks that connect.
Okay.
And then we'll get more specific in the next unit on the type of joint. Okay, let's see, moving distally then. We've got the carpal surface of the radius, which articulates heavily with the scaphoid and lunate. So that would be the primary joint that I would indicate at the wrist in terms of the connection between the hand and the forearm. We obviously have some interaction between the head of the ulnar styloid and the carpal pisiform, etc. But I'm not going to focus on that. So if I indicate the carpal surface, then the answer would be scaphoid and lunate. If I indicate the scaphoid and lunate, then the answer would be carpal surface. That's the primary bearing joint at the wrist. And then as far as any joints that interact among the carpals, it would just be adjacent carpals. So if I indicated the trapezium, then the connection would be between the trapezium and the trapezoid, and then also the trapezium and the scaphoid. So you'd look at the kind of the 4-box model that I think Maria went over. So if you've got connections this way, that way, that way. So you'd have to have kind of a mental image, I guess, or scribble it down quickly on your answer sheet and figure it out in terms of the interconnections among the carpals. Make sense?
So will we be looking at like these bones when we're doing that, or are we going to be?
Yes, they will be the bone models.
Okay.
Yeah, with
so
little pieces of tape indicating the.
Not the whole hand.
What's that?
Not the whole hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it would be an intact hand. Yes, it wouldn't be, completely unarticulated.
I mean, like we can use the bones for this articulation portion of this.
Yes, the articulation questions will be based on the actual bone.
Oh, so they'll be labeled on the bones.
Yeah, so like
Okay,
this
gotcha.
piece of tape would be there,
Okay.
and the answer sheet would be asking for an articulation answer. Of course, your answer would be as it happened.
And those ones you have to name all of it as the answer or just one?
For the articulation questions,
No, like of the carpal tunnel specifically.
for
If you like put a number here, would you have to name everything that is articulated or just like one?
I would be looking for this Okay, so then moving down onto the hand itself, articulation questions would involve the connections between the digits and the metacarpals, and then among the phalanges. Okay, let's see, we did the SI joint so then moving down onto the remainder of the lower extremity, obviously head of the femur, acetabulum, we just touched on that. At the knee, then you'd have the femoral condyles, and then the condylar surfaces, articular surfaces of the tibial condyles. You have to identify medial and lateral correctly. It would be specific to the side. We have the articulation then between the patellar groove and the patella. So you just simply put patella. I don't have to identify anything more than that. Let's see, head of the fibula articulating with the lateral condyle of the tibia. We have the fibular notch articulating with the general region would be the lateral malleolus. That would indicate the distal end of the fibula. This distal tibiofibular joint, so the fibular notch, and then the general area would be the lateral malleolus of the fibula. If you want to be really precise, you could say the medial aspect of it. I'm not sure if you could bonus points, so you may not want to take your time. Okay, let's see, then we've got the tarsal surface articulating with the talus, the hinge joint at the ankle. And then same kind of story for the foot in terms of the tarsals connecting to one another, and then the relationship between the metatarsals and the digits of the foot and the phalanges. So really just think through top to bottom and be able to identify the connections, contact points between the bones. If it's, as usual, be as precise as you can. If it's something very specific like